If you ask people what matters most for living longer, they would say cardiovascular fitness, perhaps diet, perhaps even sleep. But after reviewing over 80 studies on aging and mortality, I am convinced that the answer is something that most people overlook entirely: muscle mass. Research shows that low muscle mass is associated with a 29% increase in all-cause mortality. To put that into perspective, that effect size is comparable to stopping smoking, so it's not a marginal difference. I'm Dr. Cal. I spent 7 years working in the NHS before transitioning full-time into longevity medicine. In that time, I saw firsthand what happens when patients lose muscle. The falls, the slow recovery, the rapid decline that follows a single event. My goal with this channel is to make the medical literature accessible so you can make informed decisions about your health. In this video, I'm going to walk you through 3 core elements. The mortality data, so what the research actually demonstrates about muscle mass and lifespan. The mechanisms, so why muscle functions as a metabolic organ, not just a tissue for movement. And the protocols, specific evidence-based exercise interventions that you can implement this week. But before we examine the evidence, it's so important for us to understand what we're actually discussing here at a physiological level. Sarcopenia is the clinical term for age-related muscle loss. The word comes from the Greek sarynx, meaning flesh, and penia, meaning loss. It's characterized by progressive decline in skeletal muscle mass. In simple terms, sarcopenia is what happens when your muscles shrink and weaken with age. The tissue itself diminishes, the connection between your nerves and muscle fibers deteriorate, and your functional capacity declines. Now, there's a really important distinction to understand here. Sarcopenia refers to low muscle mass on its own. Confirmed sarcopenia means both low muscle mass and impaired physical function, so things like reduced grip strength, slow walking speed, difficulty rising from a chair. When both elements are present together, the clinical consequences are far more severe, and that distinction becomes critical when we examine the mortality data. With that foundation in place, we can examine what the data actually shows. Let me start with the numbers, because when I first looked at this research, I was genuinely surprised by the results. A 2016 study followed over 4,400 older adults for more than 14 years, and researchers measured muscle mass and function at baseline, then tracked mortality. The outcome? People with sarcopenia had a 29% higher risk of death from any cause. But what's really crazy is when the researchers examined confirmed sarcopenia, so remember that's both low muscle mass and poor physical function, the risk increased massively to 93%. The presence of both elements together not only adds to the risk, it compounds it in a big way. This tells us something super important. Muscle mass alone matters, but functional capacity is what matters even more. So what can you even use to measure muscle mass? There are lots of different ways that it can be measured, and in research settings, it's often things like a DEXA scan, bioelectrical impedance, or fancy MRI scans. But in real life, those aren't practical. A real life metric that is so much more accessible is grip strength, so it deserves some love. Grip strength is the force that you can generate when you squeeze your hand against a tool called a dynamometer. It sounds simple, but it's remarkably predictive of overall muscular health and mortality risk. And this is why grip strength is sometimes called a vital sign of aging. A meta-analysis of 38 studies encompassing nearly 2 million participants found that higher grip strengths were associated with a 31% lower risk of all-cause mortality. But what's super interesting is that the data demonstrates a clear dose-response relationship. For every 5 kilogram decrease in grip strength in men, there was a 16% greater chance of death. The stronger you are, the lower your mortality risk. Well, I'm sure you're all dying to know how common the problem actually is. Sarcopenia affects 10 to 16% of older adults globally, but after the age of 80, that number rises to as high as 50%. And although more people are becoming aware of the issue, it's still one of the most underappreciated health challenges of aging, and clearly the consequences extend far beyond mobility. So now that we have a clear picture of the epidemiology, let's look at the mechanisms. What is exactly happening inside muscles that make them so critical to longevity? Here's the key insight, and it's worth a deep dive to understand it properly. Skeletal muscle is your body's largest metabolic organ. It's not just for lifting heavy things in front of a mirror. It regulates glucose, it stores energy, and it communicates with every other system in your body. After you eat, your skeletal muscle is responsible for 80% of glucose uptake from your bloodstream. That is massive. Your muscles essentially function as a glucose sponge, pulling the sugar out of circulation and then storing it as glycogen. But when you lose muscle, you also lose that metabolic capacity. Glucose clearance becomes less efficient, blood sugar remains elevated for longer, insulin has to work harder to achieve the same effect, and over time, this drives insulin resistance and metabolic dysfunction. This is one of the reasons why sarcopenia and type 2 diabetes are so tightly linked. They share the same underlying mechanisms. But there's an entire other dimension to all of this, and it was something that I was never ever taught at medical school. Muscle plays a big role in cell signaling, which is the process by which cells communicate with one another. When you exercise, your muscles release hundreds of proteins called myokines. Think of these as DMs that your cells send to one another, but these messages aren't just reels, they trigger specific responses inside the target cell. Three of the most important are myostatin, interleukin 6, and irisin. Myostatin is a protein that acts as a natural brake on muscle growth. It belongs to a family of proteins that inhibit muscle cell proliferation. In practical terms, myostatin prevents excessive muscular gains. But here's what matters clinically. Resistance training can override that myostatin expression, essentially releasing that brake. And this is one of the mechanisms by which strength training stimulates muscular growth, particularly in older adults where myostatin levels tend to be higher at baseline. Interleukin 6 is far more complex because it has two very different roles that are context dependent. When IL-6 is chronically elevated through systemic inflation, so things like obesity, chronic disease, it's associated with muscle wasting and metabolic dysfunction. However, in its acute exercise-induced form, IL-6 has the opposite effect. It's released from contracting muscles during physical activity and demonstrates anti-inflammatory properties, improved glucose metabolism, and may even support fat oxidation, which is the use of fat as energy. The IL-6 spike that you experience during a workout is beneficial, and it's completely different from the chronic inflammatory signal. Think of it like the molecule that cried wolf. In an acute episode, the townsfolk listen and take action, but when it happens all the time, they stop listening and the molecule gets eaten. Irisin is particularly interesting from a neurological perspective. It's released during exercise and it stimulates the production of, get ready for this, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF. BDNF is a growth factor for neurons. It supports neuroplasticity, memory formation, learning, and protects against neurodegeneration. So you'll be pleased to know that when you hit the gym and do resistance training, you're not only building muscle, you're sending chemical signals to your brain that promote cognitive health and resilience. This is one of the key mechanisms that link physical exercise to reduce dementia risk. Now, this is where the story becomes a little bit more concerning, and I want you to have a clear picture of the timeline of what's happening here. After the age of 50, most people lose between 1 and 2% of their leg muscle mass per year. 1 to 2% might not sound that substantial, but when you fast forward a decade, you're looking at 10 to 20% of your muscle tissue simply disappearing. What this means in practice is that you might look in the mirror and not be able to see much of a change, but functionally, in terms of what you can do, you are considerably weaker. And that's not even the worst part. The trajectory steepens. Between the ages of 60 and 80, cross-sectional studies show strength declines of 20 to 40% per decade. Think about that. A 60-year-old who can comfortably climb stairs, carry shopping, rise from a chair without assistance, by the age of 70, they may have lost a quarter to a third of that entire strength. By 80, potentially half. And that trend isn't linear. It accelerates, which is why building that reserve capacity in your 40s, 50s, and 60s matters far more than most people realize. You need to build that stopgap so you can retire comfortably and not need to worry about your independence. Another important aspect to be aware of is that strength declines 2 to 5 times faster than the muscle mass itself. What does this mean? It means simply that having big muscles is not sufficient. You need to use them. Let me explain. Your muscles don't work in isolation. They're controlled by your nervous system through what we call motor units. A motor unit is made up of a single nerve from your spinal cord and a group of muscle fibers that it connects to. When your brain sends a signal to lift something heavy, it recruits more of these motor units to fire in unison. The quality of that connection, how many motor units you can recruit, and how quickly they fire determine your actual functional strength. And the issue is that these neural connections degrade far faster than the muscle tissue does itself. This is why someone who stops training for a year will lose strength far faster than they will lose visible muscle size. And it's why the adage, use it or lose it, is super applicable. Now let's anchor all of this data into my clinical experience, because that's where we can see it really become real. One of the starkest examples I encountered in the NHS was with elderly patients who fall and fracture their neck or femur. This is a devastating injury because it often leads to prolonged bed rest, which is required for recovery, and that results in an enormous amount of muscle loss. Then it becomes extraordinarily difficult to restore and rehab these patients back to their baseline function. And here's the vicious cycle. Sarcopenia likely contributed to the fall in the first place. The fall and then the bed rest after worsen the sarcopenia, which makes recovery harder, increasing the risk of another fall. It's a downward spiral that's so hard to break. Now, everything that I've just shown you leads to a single clinical question. What interventions can actually preserve your muscle mass and function with aging? If there is one intervention you implement from this video, it should be resistance training. A meta-analysis of 10 studies found that any amount of resistance training reduced all-cause mortality by 15%. The dose-response curve showed that this peaked at 60 minutes per week, and this was associated with a 27% reduction in mortality risk. And here's what's super encouraging. Even the very elderly individuals responded. A meta-analysis of adults aged 75 and older demonstrated significant improvements in both strength and muscle mass from resistance training program. Based on the current evidence, here is the minimum protocol I would use if I wanted to preserve muscle mass and function. Frequency, at least 2 sessions per week, as this aligns with the data showing the benefit from 60 minutes weekly. Focus, prioritize lower body movements, things like squats, leg press, step-ups, as these muscles are most critical for functional independence. Intensity, you're looking at a moderate to high intensity, so approximately 60 to 80% of your 1 rep max, or practically speaking, this translates into 8 to 12 repetitions where the final few are genuinely challenging. And I would probably look to do something like 2 to 4 sets per exercise. You don't necessarily need a gym, so things like resistance bands, body weight movements, and even carrying heavy shopping all count if you perform them with sufficient intensity to challenge the muscles. The second pillar is protein intake, and this is where I think conventional recommendations fall short. Recommended dietary allowance for protein is 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. For a 70 kg person, that's 56 grams per day. But this guideline was designed to prevent deficiency, not optimize muscle retention with age. Emerging evidence suggests that older adults should aim for 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram per day. And the reason for this is a phenomenon called anabolic resistance. As you age, your muscle becomes less responsive to protein intake. The same amount of protein that would stimulate muscle growth in a younger person produces a blunted response in an older adult. So older individuals require more protein per meal to stimulate the same anabolic signal. One final note on protein is that not all amino acids are equal for muscular gains. Leucine is a branched-chain amino acid, and it appears to be particularly important for triggering muscle protein synthesis. It's found in high concentrations in whey protein, eggs, chicken, and beef. For older adults, ensuring adequate leucine with each meal, so approximately 2.5 to 3 grams per serving, may help to overcome some of that anabolic resistance. If you truly want to maximize your longevity profile gains, then you should combine resistance training with cardiovascular exercises. The Copenhagen Heart Study found that individuals with both high respiratory fitness and high grip strength had the lowest mortality risk, 47% lower all-cause mortality compared to those individuals that were low in both measures. So, I would recommend a combined approach. 2 to 3 resistance training sessions per week, 2 to 3 cardiovascular sessions, and then incorporate balance and mobility work, so things like Tai Chi and yoga, to help prevent those devastating falls I was talking about earlier. The goal is not to become an athlete, the goal is to preserve function so that you can maintain independence and resilience as you age. The evidence is clear. Muscles aren't just for showing off at the beach, they are a metabolic organ that predicts how long you'll live, how well you'll age, and how quickly you'll recover from illness. My goal with this channel is always to make the medical literature accessible so that you can make genuinely informed decisions about your health. If this was useful, subscribing helps us reach more people, and if there's a topic you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. If you want to know why I'm even making this channel in the first place, check out this video on why I left my job as an NHS doctor to pursue longevity medicine. I have compiled all the 83 studies referenced in this video into a citation library. It's free and you can find the link in the description below. Until next time, look after yourselves.